Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Michael from the Honest Youth Pastor, and today is the third video for our Bible study, our reading through of James. I'm not sure actually what to call it, but I'm going to keep calling it a Bible study, even though it's really just us reading through James and kind of looking at it. Very impromptu. If you haven't figured it out by this point, I read over the passage before we start these videos. I've been going through James. I've been listening to the whole letter of James for, about 3 weeks now. So it's just intrigued me, and I wanted to go through it. And this is the third video of that going through. If you're interested in any of those other videos, there should be a little taggy somewhere up here where you can click and actually start back at video 1 if that sort of thing interests you. So before I belabor too much of your time, let's get right into the third section. We're going to be in James chapter 1, starting at verse 19 today. Now, before that, again, you can go back and watch the other videos, or you can just let this be a summary to you. But we've talked about how James has spoken about how trials are going to come their way. They should count them as joy. Talked a little bit about how he shows how sometimes when we doubt, we're double-minded and we're not steady, and he contrasts that with how God never changes, which is really interesting. It's interesting to see that as he lays it out. Now, again, if you want any more of that sort of, you can go back and watch video 1 or 2. But video 3 today, that brings us to verse 19, okay? So after video 1 and 2, we're now at verse 19. We're actually going to be going 19 all the way through the end. 27, verse 27 in chapter 1. So we're going to finish up chapter 1 today. And it says this. We're going to read all the way through it like we have, and then we'll just kind of go back and kind of look at it a little bit, learn from it. You're not here with me to iron sharpen iron, but we're going to look at the word today and kind of get some insights out of it. So it says this, verse 19, "Know this, my beloved brother, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word, and not just hearers only, deceiving yourself. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perceives, being no hearer who forgets but a doer that acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." Now, there's a ton there. Like today, I don't know when you're watching this. I'm recording this on, it's October 16th. Yes, October 16th. So, as you can imagine, if you're watching this anytime before the election, the election. So Twitter, online, news channels, like all of it is just angry and talking and not holding their tongue. And as I've been reading through James, or listening through James and reading through James, like the first chapter is very, pertinent to what we're talking about, like what's around us right now. Not just during the election all the times, but it's just so heightened now, right? So in verse 19, he says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Like that right there, you could probably preach a whole sermon just on that, right? The idea, he's just letting them know, after he's already talked to them about the fact that we're unsteady, that we need to ask in faith and trust that God is good, and that God himself never changes, and that no matter what we have, like riches or not, that's the example he uses in the previous verses, like we all need to trust that God is good regardless of what happens in our circumstances. And this ties right into what he's already said, which is saying, hey, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Because lots of times, and the people in James's day are no different, right? People are people. The idea is that we always want, like, if we think we're right, we're always going to speak up. Even when we're not right, sometimes we speak up. Even when we think we were right, then we get called out, then we dig in our heels just to prove a point, right? Like we do that. I do that a lot. Not just online, but like just all the time. And what he's trying to remind his people here, right? The people he's writing to, and subsequently us throughout time, is that we need to shut up, right? We need to be quick to hear people. We need to be very slow to speak, and then we need to be slow to anger. And I think all of these coincide with one another, right? So we just need to be quiet. We need to listen. And this just means, I think, in every conversation, right? So you can draw any implication you want, given your current circumstances, right? So it could be politics, or it could be, the whole race situation that's really brewed up right now, or it could be just somebody that's your enemy, like at work, right? Somebody that's just causing you all sorts of trouble within a friendship. Like all of these things, like we could read that with those lenses on our eyes. But I think what we need to do is take those lenses off a second and just remember the words that James is saying, right? Within the context of the people he's writing to, he's saying, look, there's going to be trials. There's going to be things you go through. You need to receive them with joy, knowing that God is good. And when you're in them, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. So the whole time we're sitting here, we're listening, we're not talking in these trials and these tribulations of various kinds, he says at the beginning of chapter 1. And he says slow to anger because, and he follows this up with something I think is vitally important, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. There's lots of times, I think, regardless of what happens, so whether we're going through some sort of trial. Most of the time when there is a trial or there's a situation that happens, there's somebody or something that could be possibly responsible for us going through that. Now, sometimes that's us, but oftentimes we just want to blame somebody else. So everybody I've ever dealt with, if they're going through something, they will find somebody to blame. It's never our fault. It's always somebody else's fault. And sometimes somebody else really is at fault. But what he's indicating here is that we need to be very slow to anger in these trials and tribulations of various kinds because we're trusting in God. We know he's got it in control. And we can be slow to anger because our anger does not produce the righteousness of God. Now, it doesn't mean that anger is wrong. In fact, throughout the Bible, there's demonstrations and examples of righteous anger. But he says whenever we're not, I think it kind of ties in line here, if we're not being quiet, if we're not listening and we're not controlling our anger, nothing good can come from talking, not listening, and being mad, right? That's the short of it. Verse 21, it says, therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness and receive the meekness of the implanted word, which is able to save your soul. There's something here that is connected in the sense that he's saying we need to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, because that doesn't produce anything good. So we need to therefore take off this filthiness, this wickedness, and then receive, rather, the implanted word. So all of these things that happen to us in these trials and these various tribulations that we're trusting in God to get us through because we know he's in control of all things, going back to the previous 2 videos, that when that happens, we understand he's in control, so we can stop for a minute, we can listen for a minute, we can control our anger because we know that nothing good comes from it. In the sense that there's a righteous anger, but there's also an anger, he says, that doesn't lead to. So we need to weigh that, but we need to take off all of that filthiness and instead receive the meekness implanted in the word, which is able to save your soul. Now, some commentaries here, you can agree or disagree. I think there's room for that on both sides, but some commentaries say that this is indicating like this indwelling sanctification, this progressive sanctification in our lives. That as we grow closer to Christ, we are able to, we're becoming more like him. So we're becoming more patient. We're becoming more loving. We're becoming, that anger that we have, when we do have it, is directed in the right direction. There's this sanctification process that's happening because we're in the Word. We understand that, like the previous verses said, God is in control. Now, this is the important, there's a shift here in verse 22, okay? There's a shift that happens because we've talked about everything we've talked about up to this point. He's saying, be slow to anger, understand that you need to take off the filthiness, the rampant wickedness, and instead receive the implanted word. And verse 22 is like a mic drop moment. He says, but be doers of the word, not just hearers, deceiving yourselves. Now, before we move on to verse 23, like that should be, sometimes we read over things in the Bible. Okay, so we're just like, oh yeah, duh, like we've heard that 1,000 times. Like we don't consider the fact that this is a legitimate concern that James has for the people he's writing to. It's a thing that like he seems concerned about it because he brings it up and he goes into this huge thing about, he unpacks it. So we need to sit and realize that, hey, are there times where we just hear it and we've actually deceived ourselves into thinking we believe it? This goes back to the previous verses that he's talked about, right? Verses 1 through 18, where you've heard the word, you've heard the gospel, but it's not affecting you. So you're actually deceiving yourself, which goes back to what he talks about in the beginning of chapter 1, which is the double-minded man driven and tossed by the wind, verse 6, chapter 1. The idea here is that you hear it, but we've deceived ourselves into thinking we actually believe it or we've implemented it, because he says in verse 23, for if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's a man who looks intently at his natural face in the mirror, for he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. He's saying like you read it, you know it, you've heard it, but like as soon as you leave, like nothing has changed. What good does that do you? Like what good does hearing the word do for you is if you're like really in it now and then you leave and you're like, I don't know what it was said. Like that's the implication he's giving, is that you blank, you forget about it as soon as you leave. So what good is that? Verse 25, but the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perceives, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer that acts, he is blessed in his doing. This is a really, like I said, it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail because he goes into it later. We'll get into it in following chapters. But the idea here is that when it affects you, it affects you. It's not that you just forget. It's that the word does something into you. The word that back in verse 21, he says, receive the meekness and implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Like something happens to you whenever when you hear it. It does something in you to where now it's not just hearing, it's actually a doing. So, and there's a little hint here in verse 26 of what he's going to say in the rest of the chapter. Rest of the letter. If anyone thinks he is religious, but does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. What? Okay, so take that in context to, right now, again, I'm assuming you're watching this, or majority of you guys are watching this when it comes out, which is before the election, right? Okay, so let's read this one more time, just so we can get it. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Now, keep in mind here, James isn't using religious or religion as we commonly do, which is like, that's a dirty word. It's a relationship, not a religion. Okay, that's not how he's using it. He's using it and saying that if you do not bridle your tongue, you deceive your very own heart, and your religion is worthless. He's echoing back to what he just said about you're hearing it, you're hearing it, but you're deceiving yourself. Nothing is affected. He says, like, if you say you're religious, but you don't control your own tongue, okay, well, what good does that do you? There's a connection here that James makes, that when we are going through trials and various tribulations and we're trusting in God and we're taking off the wickedness and putting on the imperishable or the meekness and implanted word, that there's like a change. Like there's a direct correlation here for James, that when you hear it, the outcome of that shows that if you're deceived or if you're not deceived. The things that happen in your life are a direct correlation, a direct result of if you've actually heard it. And then he gives a minor example just to kind of, I think, push that home a little bit. Verse 27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. There's certain things that are said in the scriptures that I think we read over and we're like, okay, yeah, that's great. One of them that really hit me was when I was reading through Matthew, getting ready for a sermon in Matthew, where Jesus tells the Pharisees twice, where I forget the exact wording. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. He tells them once to go look that up. And then 2 chapters later, and I forget the exact verse reference, I'm sorry. Again, this is off the cuff. But I think it's like 2 chapters later, he says, what did I tell you? I told you to go look that up. And if you would have understood that, you would have understood why I interact with people the way I interact with people, essentially. I mean, again, it's not exactly what he says. But the idea is that he's telling them that if they were to understand what he had told them to look up and do, they would understand what he was doing. I say that to say this. Here, James specifically says that religion that is pure and undefiled before God is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Right? So it stands to reason to me that Christians or churches, but really, James isn't talking about the church as we know it. He's talking about Christians. He's talking about people that claim the name of Christ. That if we claim the name of Christ, one thing that we should definitely be doing is taking care of the vulnerable in society, which in this case, definitely in James's day, are the orphans, which have no one to provide for them, and the widows that don't have anyone to protect them or to provide for them either. The idea here is that James is saying that, look, if you're looking for what your religion looks like actually lived out, like that actually has affected you, you're going to be going out and protecting the orphans and the widows. You're going to be taking care of those that cannot take care of themselves. You're going to be being a voice for those that can't speak up for themselves, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So there's 2 things he says here about religion that's undefiled, a religion that actually is a lived out religion after it's an understood, heard one, is that you'll go out and take care of those that can't take care of themselves, and there will be a distinct difference from you and the world. Like, you'll be able to tell the 2 apart. So that's chapter 1. A real quick summary. He says you're going to be faced with various trials back in chapter 1. When those trials come, ask for wisdom because you're going to need it, but don't ask as a double-minded person because you're not going to get anything from that. Don't put your faith in your money or your wealth or anything like that. Boast only, whether you be poor or be rich, boast only in the Lord, because he isn't changing. He never changes, and everything good comes from him. Everything bad, he says, comes from the fact when we see desire, and then desire leads to sin, and sin leads to death. And then today what we read, where he says, okay, so you understand that God is good, that he's always faithful, that you should trust in him. But now that you've heard this word, you should be slow to speak, quick to listen, and slow to anger. And in doing that, you're going to show your faith by you've heard the word, you've received the indwelled word, and now that has an effect on what you do in life. But there's 2 warnings here that you shouldn't assume that it's actually something that you have. Just because you've heard it, if there's no doing, he questions whether you've actually heard it. Same thing on that. He says if you can't bridle your tongue, your religion is worthless. Like, there's some pretty stern warnings here in chapter 1. All right, guys, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Come back every Monday for a new video as we walk through the letter that James wrote. I'll talk to you later.